Bobby Kennedy's next.
I have my uncle Teddy's best friend in the Senate for a long time was a guy called John Culver, who was a senator from Idaho. And after he left the Senate, he became a lobbyist. And I asked him one day whether any of his lobbyist clients made political donations to my brother Joe, who was then in Congress. And he said, no, I wouldn't recommend that to them because Joe thinks it's all legit. In other words, he thinks they're giving him money because they believe in what he's, what he's fighting for. And that's what, to me, that was kind of the centerpiece of who Barry Goldwater was. He thought it was legit. He thought, he believed in something. He believed in this ideology, and he believed, as Professor Diggins said, that if you reduce the size of government, that you're going to increase personal freedom, and that then all these other great effects are going to follow. And he became a great fighter for freedoms that people don't associate with the conservative movement, like gay rights. He called himself an honorary gay. He said that, and this is in Arizona, before Brokeback Mountain came out. He said that he said, of course gays should be in the military. You don't need to be straight to shoot straight. He campaigned, of course, he campaigned for abortion rights. He, in this book, he takes the position against prayer in public schools. He says, the moral development of a child should occur at home. That's not what we pay government to do. And it was his integrity, his absolute integrity, his personal charm and charisma, and his total passion about these issues that really changed, allowed him to hijack the Republican Party away from the traditional moderates like Rockefeller and Margaret Chase Smith and Dwight Eisenhower, and basically turn it over to this new ideology of conservatives, which at that point were regarded as these kind of marginalized, John Birch Society nuts. But he brought it mainstream. And he lived to see a time when his brand of conservatism was hijacked away from him by people he ultimately detested and who perverted virtually every one of the pillars that he considered the fundaments of modern conservatism. And that hijacking was engineered primarily by one of his acolytes, Paul Weyrich, and another guy called Richard Vigoret, who engineered this coalition between, these were people who were more cynical than Goldwater and were tired of living in the ghetto, as they called it, of perpetual defeat. And they understood that American politics is driven by democracy. Power in our country is driven by two great forces. One is political intensity, in other words, populism, and the other is money. And they were able to, since a lot of this ideology traditionally justified corporate profit-taking, they were able to get Wall Street on their side and the big money, but they needed a populist front. And in order to do that, they reached out to the Christian right. They went and organized the moral majority. They got these reluctant preachers, Jerry Falwell and Dobson and a bunch of others, to come on board. And then they created these think tanks, these phony think tanks in Washington, D.C., because they're not really about thinking. They present themselves about, they're about engineering or devising justifications, these kind of veiled justifications for corporate profit-taking and for the accumulations of great wealth and for the destruction of the middle class and the enriching of the rich. And they're the product of these extraordinary, political minds, and their energies has been the present government that we have in Washington, at least until a few months ago, which controlled not only the presidency but also both houses of Congress and a large part of the judicial system in our country. And it's not conservatism, and it's not any, as Goldwater recognized and said many, many times, this is not the kind of, this has nothing to do with conservatism. They call themselves conservative, but what they really, and they've been able to gull, our indolent, negligent press, as well as a large portion of the American public, into believing that they're, an administration of values, and particularly of conservative values, but all the values that they claim to embrace appear to me to be these kind of hollow facades, these Hollywood facades that mask the one value that they really consider worth fighting for. If you look at their feet, rather than listening to the kind of the seductive noises that come from their mouths, which is corporate profit-taking. They claim that they're conservatives, but they have torn the conserve out of conservatism. You know, they have mounted this deliberate, concerted attack on 30 years of environmental law and our legacy, you know, which Goldwater fought so hard for, you know, making the Grand Canyon a park and protecting the natural legacy of our country. They say that they like free markets, but they despise free market capitalism. What they really embrace is corporate crony capitalism, corporate welfare, capitalism for the poor, and socialism for the rich. And what we have to understand as Americans is that there's a huge difference between free market capitalism, which makes a nation more efficient, more prosperous, and more democratic, and the kind of corporate crony capitalism which has been embraced now inside the Beltway in Washington, D.C., which is as antithetical to democracy, efficiency, and prosperity in America as it is in Nigeria. They claim, of course, one of the fundamental pillars of conservatism is fiscal restraint. And this has been the most profligate, free spending administration that we've ever had, as was Ronald Reagan's, you know, which drove a $1 trillion debt to a $3 trillion debt. And these people have, you know, driven this, you know, gigantic, what was it, $6 trillion 10-year surplus that Bill Clinton left us into a $10 trillion 10-year deficit. So, you know, just a huge shift in wealth from future generations and from our social infrastructure in our country and from the poor and from the middle class into the hands of the wealthiest Americans. They claim to, of course,